So again, I want to speak about God's will, and in the broadest sense, Ernest Holmes, who founded Centers for Spiritual Living, basically says that God's will for us is our will for ourselves, as long as it doesn't hurt or intrude on anybody else. And you know, he says somewhere else that you're really probably not going to get everything you wanted, because if we go pretty wild, if we got everything we wanted. But again, as long as nobody else is being hurt, whatever our dream is for our life is God's will for us. And he goes on and he says that God's gifts are given to all of us freely, just like the air and the sunshine is, and they're given the same to everybody. And the vehicle for us to co-create and to accept God's gifts is our free will, and our ability with that to think and to choose. And he wrote, and he said, freedom of will means the ability to do, say, and think as one wishes, to express life as one personally desires. To be able to merely think and dream of freedom would not be liberty. And he goes on, this is from the Science of Mind. He goes on and he talks about how a prisoner can think and dream of it, but can't really act on it, and so they don't have the liberty. And so I want to do a Bible quote. I want to talk about something Eric Butterworth wrote. Every time I talk about Eric Butterworth, I always say I think he's the greatest New Thought minister in our lifetime. And so he quotes from the Bible and from Matthew, and it says, "Ask and it shall be given to you. Seek and you shall find. Knock and it shall be opened to you. For everyone that asks receives, and he that seeks finds, and to him that knocks it shall be opened." And Butterworth goes on and he talks about it, and he says, now notice, it doesn't say ask and maybe it'll be worked out. Seek, and who knows, if you're lucky, someday you may find it. He said that's not what Jesus said. And Butterworth goes on and he said, asking, seeking, and claiming is our birthright to God's gifts. And when we ask, seek, or claim, he said what we're really doing is commanding spiritual law, and spiritual law always responds. And then I just want to go on and do the rest of that quote from Matthew 7. And Jesus says, "Who is the man among you who, when his son asks him for bread, will hand him a stone? Or if he should ask for a fish, will hand him a snake? If therefore you who err know how to give good gifts to your sons, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him?" So first of all, I know he means sons and daughters, but that's not the way they wrote it. But what he's really saying there, what I picked up, is if those of us who are human and mess up from time to time and are far from perfect, if we know how to give our children what they seek and good gifts, rather than when they ask for something to give them coal at Christmas, if we know how to do that, imagine how much more God knows how to do that for you and I. So I was reading a blog this week by a lady who talks about an experience she had in church, and she doesn't mention that it's one of our churches, that it's Agape, but it happened in Santa Monica, and Agape is was a huge church in Santa Monica. That's Michael Beckwith Church. And she says her life was going through a very difficult period, and she was having trouble getting work, and she was really despondent. And she was in church this particular day begging for God to help her. And she said she was going over and over again, "Please, God, please God, over and over. And at some point, she heard a voice within, and the voice said, Joan, no more, please God. The power is in you. Use it. And she said, in that moment, in that day, her life changed. What she realized was, and it became clear to her, that God was within, and she had to take responsibility for the power that was within her, and she needed to use it to help herself. That God gave us the power to heal our lives. But first, we need to believe it. We need to believe that we have that power and that ability. And when we believe it, what happens is we begin to accept ourselves, we begin to love ourselves, and when that happens, we'll never again be a victim. We'll be more in control of our lives, and things will happen through us rather than to us. You know, we all have good times and we all have bad times. But even when we're going through bad times, the universe is still with us. And those times are an opportunity for us to grow spiritually and to learn spiritually. And true inner peace comes when we believe that the universe is always on our side, no matter what is happening. And you know, I say this sometimes, it's easy to get up here and say that true inner peace will always come to us when we believe the universe is always on our side. Well, when a love leaves you, when you get a bad diagnosis, when somebody you care about dies, it's not that easy to always believe that the universe is on our side. But it is, and I'll just say, I hadn't intended to say this, when that does happen to you, that's why the Jennas, the Beckys, the Rons, the Patrice, the Edgars are here to be with you and know that for you and know your truth. We're all here to love and support you. So I read an article this week by a Catholic brother named David Steidl Rast, and he says to us kind of what Ernest Holmes has been saying, that we can trust in life. And he said deep trust in life is a choice. It's a choice that we deliberately take. And he said it's called courage. It's called courage. And then he said something, I put it in a different way, and I read it a couple of times. I thought, that's really an interesting way to put it. And he said, people that are grateful and people that have trust in life are willing to give it a second chance. Think about that. I thought it was a really different way to say it, that we're really willing to give life a second chance, to be open and to surprise us. And he said, the more you move forward in trust, the more the fog will lift. So I want to move to something else, a way that God shows its love and its caring for us. And Ernest Holmes said that, and I want to talk about intuition. And Ernest Holmes said that intuition is God in man, and just like instincts rule animals, if we would be open to it, intuition would guide us. And you know, sometimes we call it that still small voice, and intuition comes to us in a lot of different ways. Mary Morrison, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, but she has a chapter in one of her books on intuition, and she talks about Puccini, who wrote the opera Madame Butterfly. And at some point in his life, Puccini said that opera came to him through him from God, and it was dictated to him by God, and he said, I merely put it down on paper. So Mary tells this story about a letter she got from one of her congregants who was going through a really, really difficult time. She was desperate, she was lonely, she had just lost her job, and wasn't sure what to do and where to go. And somehow she heard about a singles potluck, and she decided not to go. And a voice kept telling her, go. And she kept ignoring the voice. And the voice was really persistent. And she decided, I don't feel well, I don't want to go to a potluck. And by now, I'd be an hour late anyway. So she said, I'm not going. And the voice kept, go, go. And finally, I guess God could be a real nudge. And so she said, okay. So she runs to the store and she gets some chips and dip, shows up at the potluck over an hour late, and gets one of the last seats at one of the last tables, and she sits down alongside a guy, and they start to talk, and he's got his own business, and he's looking for somebody with exactly the skills that this woman possesses. And she said, I got my dream job because I finally listened to my intuition. You know, and the fact is that our intuition will never lead us astray. So I want to tell you two other more personal stories about intuition, one about me and one about Beck. And with me, the way I prepare the messages is every Wednesday, Becky does tons of research for me. And I might go through like, I don't know, 20 books or 25 books that she puts, we agree on a topic, and she puts stickers on different pages and chapters and says, here, go read these. And so that's what I do on Friday. And I might come out, like for this message, I have 10 pages of notes, sometimes more. And then what I do on Saturday, almost never, sometimes I do, but almost never, I always go back through my notes, but I almost never say, well, what would be a first step, and what would be the logical next step, and what would be the logical next step. I always do it through my intuition. I just let it go, and I say, all right, I'll do this one next, and I'll do that. And sometimes I get a message. Sometimes when I'm taking notes, I'll get a message. This will be a good opener for you, or read this. This will be a good ending for your talk. But most of the time, and I hope my talks seem logical, they go from one logical point, but it's not me doing the logic. I really just let it go, and whatever message I get to do this next, do this next, do this next, is not from me. I totally rely on my intuition that I'm gonna have something decent that people will listen to. And the other example, and Becky knows I'm gonna give this as an example, okay? So Becky was married once before, and we talked about this yesterday, and she told me weeks before the wedding, she kept getting an intuitive hint, don't do this, right? Something like that, don't do this. And she kept ignoring the intuitive hint. And it was rather persistent. And she ignored it, and then when it got so persistent, she said, well, I really can't ignore this because my best friend, who's gonna be my maid of honor, already has her dress, and I already have my dress. And Becky has, it was gonna be a small wedding, but Becky has relatives in Idaho and lots of places, and they were all invited, not to the wedding, but to a party after the wedding, and she said the invitations are all out. And even the day of the wedding, before she walked down the aisle, she got intuitive hits. Don't do this, don't do this. And she did it. And 3 months later, they were divorced. 3 months. And instead of having, we were talking about this, she got to one of her aunts and who lives in California. She said, what am I gonna do now? I invited everybody to my wedding party. And her aunt said, well, just have a divorce party. So that's what they did. But the point is, you know, we ignore our intuition, which is spirit guiding us to higher and better things. We ignore it at our own risk. Of course, she wound up way better. I reminded her of that yesterday. So I read a blog by somebody yesterday who said, or Friday, who said that there's something very peaceful about surrendering ourselves to God and believing that He will guide our steps, that God, not He, but divine presence will guide us. And she said, you know, Spirit didn't create us. Think about this now. Spirit didn't create us to be passive. That we have amazing powers and amazing potential. We have a mind. We have the ability to love. We have free will. And she said, God has great faith in us. Faith enough that God gave us the power to co-create. Think about that. So years ago, I read something by Rod Serling, who said, you know, in our life, there's not going to be a clap of thunder and this big bony hand coming down from the sky and pointing at you and saying, you're the anointed one. He said, it doesn't work like that. You've got to earn it. And I saw that again this week, and it reminded me of a fable that I want to share with you. And it's a fable about two brothers long ago who once a year travel far and wide to go meet with, God bless you, who go meet with their guru, their teacher. And every year when they go meet, they stay at the same inn. And they've become really good friends with the owner of the inn because they stay there for a week. And so one year, when they're about to go meet their teacher, the innkeeper calls them over and says, I was wondering if you brothers would do me a favor. He said, my wife and I have been trying to have a baby, and it's not working. And my wife is very sad. And I've heard that your teacher has great powers of prayer. Would you ask him to pray for my wife and I to have a baby? And they say, of course we will. And as they leave the inn and are walking to meet with their teacher, they see his wife. And she's pushing a baby carriage. And they look at one another and say, does she have a baby? What's going on? And they look, and the carriage is empty. But she's pushing this carriage. And people in the town that are walking by her, when she can't see, they go, something's wrong with her. And they go and they meet with their teacher. A year later, let's move forward a year, they come back. And before they even reach the inn, they hear a party and music and laughter. And they go into the inn. And the owner comes over and hugs them and says, oh my God, your teacher does do miracles. She's had the baby. And everybody's happy except one of the brothers. And when they go to the teacher that day, he asks if he could see the teacher one-on-one. And when he goes in, he starts to cry. And he says, we have been coming here for years, and you're my teacher, and I love you, and my friend. And for years, I've been asking you to pray for my wife to have a child, and nothing. And now this innkeeper, who you don't even know, who's not your friend, he asks you to pray for his wife to have a child. And just like that, it happens. Tell me why. And the teacher says to him, you know I love you, and we will always be friends. But let me ask you a question. Did your wife buy a baby carriage? And for me, the point of the fable is we need to act. We need, when we want something and we want to co-create, and God is open to that happening, you know, it's kind of like, I don't want to get political, but it's kind of like the argument about the Second Amendment. You know, prayer's cool, but you need to take action. We need more than that. We need to step in and we need to do what we want. God doesn't just come down like Rod Sterling said and go, you're the anointed. We need to do something. That Spirit gave us the tools to create and to change our lives, but we need to use them, and we need to step out and make changes happen. So I want to close speaking about Joel Goldsmith, and he's one of the early new thought writers, I guess in our time too, and he talks about embarking on a spiritual life, and he says, you know, if you want to embark on a spiritual life, you don't need to give up your job, you don't need to give up your family, you don't need to move to a new community. He said, what it means is living by certain spiritual principles. And he said the most important one is to practice the presence of God, to see God everywhere, in everything. And he goes on and he says, you know, God doesn't withhold anything from anyone, that the rain falls, you know, as it says in the Bible, on the just and the unjust. And he said, God is love, and God doesn't punish. And he said, until you can see the nature of God as purely good, you're not realizing the one God that really is. And then he goes on and he says, you know, every day is holy. Monday is just as holy as Sunday is. There's no such thing as relaxing from holiness, that every day is a day for prayer. And he said, the other thing I think that's really important, he said the kingdom of God doesn't have to be sought, it merely has to be recognized. And then he said, wouldn't it be wonderful, and I'll close with this, if every day we said this: I am living and moving and having my being in the Word of God, keeping the Word of God alive in me, abiding in the Word and letting the Word abide in me. I know when I arise in the morning, or even before rising, on first awakening in the morning, it becomes necessary to consciously remember this is God's day, and God goes before me to make crooked places straight. God goes before me to bless. God will be with me every step of my way. Omnipresence guarantees that if I got up in heaven, I will find God. If I make my bed in hell, I will find God. If I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will find God. And there will be no time during this day when I will be outside the realm of God. I will keep my mind stayed on God, and I will acquaint myself now with him and acknowledge him in all ways. So thank you for being here. God bless you, and have a wonderful week.